The moon blew up without warning and for no apparent reason. Neal Stephenson's novel Seveneves begins with the moon blowing up, not in an incandescent fiery ball like you would expect from most movies, but the way things actually blow up in space, just, huge chunks of rock going in every direction. The giant chunks of rock that bang against each other and break up into smaller but still giant chunks of rock which, slowly begin to orbit around the planet, and some of them fall to the planet. The first 2/3 of this novel are a sort of survival disaster novel. Basically, chunks of the moon keep falling to Earth, some of them, hitting the Earth's atmosphere and burning up, and eventually enough of them start falling through the Earth's atmosphere that the entire atmosphere ignites and burns everything that's on the planet up, including most of the human race. Humanity sets about trying to survive this disaster by sending as many people up into space as they can to build a colony in space, kind of built around the near-future version of the ISS, the International Space Station. And this colony of people up in space, it's basically their story of how they go about attempting to survive this massive, catastrophic, world-ending disaster. As with any Neal Stephenson novel, it's full of lots of big, sciencey ideas, but also lots of technical language and exposition. Reading Neal Stephenson kind of reminds me of reading Victor Hugo, in the sense that Victor Hugo can spend pages and pages and pages describing a crowd of people and what they're all wearing and what they all had for breakfast that morning and how they got to be here in this crowd and what they're feeling and what they're thinking and everything that's going on. If you read this book, be prepared to read pages and pages about orbital mechanics and the physics of zero-G and, how they would build things in space and how robots would work and programming of robots and all kinds of very nitty-gritty down into the details sort of description. If you liked The Martian, you'll probably like this book. That is, a book that's, really into the details. Sounds like it's been written by an engineer. Even though I really liked all that technical sciencey stuff, I enjoyed the pages of description of orbital mechanics. What actually hooked me the most about this novel, and where I think it does its most important work, is around the human questions of what is our basic nature when confronted with total world-ending catastrophe. This novel goes to some really bleak places. If you're looking for an opportunity to basically dwell on and mourn the passing of all of human civilization and culture for the past 10,000 years, this novel is your chance to do that. If you're curious about the question about, basic human nature and whether or not facing a catastrophe of that variety we would ultimately, band together in a show of cooperation and altruism, striving for this greater good, the survival of our species, or whether or not we would, fracture apart into selfish and self-interested bands of people or groups or individuals of people just trying to get what they can while they can. If you're curious about how people would respond and react, this is your opportunity for that. If you want to read a story about survival in the vein of Robinson Crusoe, but in the bleakest, most dire of all possible imaginable circumstances, this novel is your opportunity for that. And also, if you just want to indulge your curiosity about some very far out and yet scientifically still fairly realistic hypothetical space scenarios, this novel is full of that too. And from my perspective, who loves talking about mythology and stories and how we make meaning out of our lives, one of the most interesting aspects of this novel is that faced with the near eradication of the entire human species, most religions fail and lose their relevance to the survivors' lives, having seen that the sort of narratives they use to construct meaning don't survive the destruction of the entire planet and all of human civilization very well. And yet, even though most religions fail, the core function of religion, which is to sort of provide a narrative which can give meaning and context to people's lives, survives. And there's new mythologies which begin to develop out of this experience of the destruction of the moon and the eradication of human life on Earth. Neal Stephenson himself is clearly far more interested in the physics of how space habitats rotate to create artificial gravity than he is in how meta-narratives and mythology arise out of human experience to explain what's going on with our lives. Nevertheless, he does seem to say that it's inevitable, necessary, maybe even good part of human social experience that's these myths and narratives arise. Another thing really we're saying about Seveneves is that since it deals with humanity coping with trying to survive this massive global scale catastrophe, it obviously has analogs, parallels to our current situation in dealing with global climate change. This is worse than global climate change, but maybe not that much worse than global climate change in some ways, in the sense that it's still a catastrophe. Global climate change is still a catastrophe which will require the entire species to unite, to work together, to form common cause and expend massive amounts of resources and energy attempting to adjust, avert, survive what is likely to be the fallout, the result of this action. The difference, the critical difference is that in Seveneves, the explosion of the moon is caused by an unknown. The critical difference is that in Seveneves, the explosion of the moon isn't caused by humanity itself, whereas global climate change is something we are doing to ourselves. So, if anything, the real situation, the real parallel in our world is more tragic than the situation that Neal Stephenson proposes in his book. So that's Seveneves, long book, big reads, but well worth your time. There's a little bit of a hurdle to get over in terms of how much you personally enjoy long stretches of technical language and exposition, but very rewarding in terms of the hypotheticals that it proposes and the visions that it gives you of potential futures for our species, even in the face of huge looming catastrophe.